We are live with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today, I'm joined by our special guest, Paul Greene of Global Sports Advocates. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
So, Paul, you're our resident legal expert here at SCI, and today we're going to take on the topic of Title IX, not from a broad historical perspective, but really what are some of the current issues that are going on. And I think folks aren't always up to speed on where we're at with that. So maybe you could give us a little background into how we got to where we are, just enough to set the stage for our current topic.
Sure, Josh. Well, historically, people are familiar with Title IX from the perspective of how it gave women's rights in the athletic arena and provided for equal opportunity on the basis of gender. But more recently, Title IX is becoming a heavily litigated area when it comes to sexual harassment, sexual assault on campus. It was an area of Title IX that was recognized by the United States Supreme Court about 10 to 15 years ago. And ever since, it's an increasingly hot area of the law in the sense that there are a lot more reports of assault on campus. And now universities really need to be aware of how to handle these situations when they arise.
You just gave a talk on this at the Sports Lawyers Association as well, correct?
I didn't directly give the talk, but I was certainly there and heard it was given. I gave a talk on doping, to just be clear, but I was there for the Title IX talk, and it was very enlightening.
Great. So I know a lot of administrators are really concerned with how to get ahead of some of this, and they're trying to figure out, obviously, with sexual assault being a major issue on college campuses, and then the high-profile nature of athletic programs, trying to figure out what they can do. Can you give a little bit of at least a layout of what are some of the major concerns that they should be aware of?
Well, the legal standard says that that a university could be liable for a situation involving a sexual assault on campus if there was somebody who was in essentially a leadership position who had actual knowledge that there was a sexual predator on campus and was deliberately indifferent to that person, meaning they allowed them to remain on campus essentially, and therefore led to the assault that eventually happened against that student. So what really today, the best way university can get out ahead of this is to have a policy in place where they can anticipate that this kind of thing will happen. And then when it does, they're prepared. So identifying, what these things mean in terms of terms that student athletes can understand, doing training to explain to them that these situations might occur. And then if they do get wind of somebody on campus who has been a sexual offender in the past or somebody who might be a risk to student athletes, they certainly need to address that and make sure that that person doesn't remain on campus.
So what makes it so complex? Because I know in theory that sounds fairly simple. You get out in front of it, look at some of the victims' rights and what we need to do and make sure that you're not supporting someone who's an offender in any way. Why is this becoming such a complex issue for campuses?
Well, the first part is that it's not just teacher to student, it's also peer to peer. So you could have a student athlete on campus that assaults another student athlete, and then that also could make the university liable in a more recently recognized part of the Title IX jurisprudence. The peer-to-peer harassment is now also an area that a school could be liable. So it's not always so obvious, maybe at first, and schools aren't always equipped to be on top of every student and every professor on the campus. Human resources departments aren't that large, and sometimes these things slip through the cracks. So it's best to hire lawyers and be out on top and be in front of it, because if you don't, you can end up really, really paying for it on the back end.
What about from a culture standpoint? Is there some liability if there is essentially a culture that creates an environment that supports some of this behavior, right? Whether it's hazing or traditions or anything else that might be going on that has roots in the past, but maybe in the current mode, it's actually creating an environment that supports some of this behavior.
No question. You're talking about there's a parallel claim available to Title IX under the Constitution for that if there's a culture of hazing or sexual harassment on campus. And that's a bit of a higher standard, but you certainly have that available. And the advantage there is that there are attorney's fees provisions available under Section 1983. If you can successfully bring a constitutional claim against a school that's a state actor, then you could really, really end up with a big judgment against you if that person who brings the claim is successful on the basis of claiming that there was a culture on campus, that the school didn't do anything, and that all these fraternity parties and all this stuff that happened over the years, it could have been ended at some point, and it wasn't. And that's why they got to where they got in terms of the assault that occurred.
Now, is that something that we're finding in athletic departments as well, or is that been mostly in Greek life or some of the other student groups?
No, it's definitely present in athletic departments. I mean, you go back and look at some of the cases under Title IX, you have coaches, and I'm talking high prominent coaches in university athletic departments, who are saying completely sexually charged things to students, male coaches with female student athletes, female coaches with male student athletes. It's not unique to just male coaches and female student athletes. And they say and do stuff talking about sex life openly with 18, 19-year-old kids, and the schools don't do anything about it because maybe those coaches are winning a lot, or they just think it was a joke, or who knows what the reason is. But those things are obviously unacceptable in today's day and age. And even if they were acceptable 15 or 20 years ago in a school setting, they're not acceptable today.
So you mentioned coaches and their behavior. How proactive do athletic directors need to be on this? Is it, if they're simply not aware of it, are they okay, or do they have to be fairly proactive in ensuring that there's a healthy climate there?
No, again, they can't just cry ignorance and say, "Oh, we had no idea." I mean, if the warning signs are there, if you have 10 students that are going to come forward and say everybody in the athletic department knew, and if the athletic director didn't know, they were just clueless, that indifference is enough to have the school on the hook for liability. It's not simply to just basically hold up our hands and say we had no idea. That doesn't work.
And now I imagine for victims, it's very hard to come forward and feel particularly safe. What are some of the structural mechanisms that a university can do to create an environment that does allow whistleblowers to come forward if there's concerns around some of these Title IX issues?
Well, one of the things that we've talked about in the past that I think would be an extremely forward-thinking and helpful move for any athletic department is to institute some sort of an ombudsman program where people can go to that person as a third-person neutral that's confidential and tell them what's happening. But short of that, there's got to be some sort of reporting procedure / mechanism where people can feel free to come forward without fear of reprisal. And certainly in the idea of a third-party witness that wants to help, there's whistleblowing and anti-retaliation pieces of Title IX where somebody can come forward and not fear that they're going to lose their job or they're going to have blowback as a result of having the courage to come forward and report something.
Yeah, that fear of reprisal that you mentioned is a very important part of it, where I know a lot of athletic directors and coaches will say, well, I have an open door policy. Anyone can come to me any time. And what are some of the reasons why that structure doesn't work in its own right? To simply say, look, I have an open door policy. Any of my student athletes can come and talk to me if they have concern about anything at any point in time. Why is that not enough?
Well, maybe that's the coach who's actually committing the sexual harassment. So if they are, certainly the person won't feel comfortable coming forward and telling their own coach, or they may be afraid. They may be afraid to tell that coach because they're fear of losing their spot on the team, fear of losing their scholarship, fear of losing their spot in the school. I mean, these are high stakes things for these students who are relatively young. I mean, I'm now old, but I look back and think the people in college are basically still children. And, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, in the sense that they're very vulnerable, and, they need to be treated and understood that that's the way it is. And it's hard to come forward and tell something to a coach you may not trust completely, to keep that information in confidence.
And often there's a lot on the line with scholarships and playing time and all these other things that have brought someone to the campus to begin with too. Right.
I mean, why would the student athlete is not going to want to go and tell the coach something that might affect their ability to stay in the school? That's certainly not going to happen. So they'll just keep it to themselves if they're afraid that telling somebody will end up having negative consequences on them instead of a positive situation. And it could be a very high-profile athlete in the school who committed the assault or is alleged to have committed it. And then you have a very uncomfortable situation where you don't know where the school is going to turn and how they're going to take it.
So, Paul, what about for coaches? How proactive do they need to be in vetting folks that they're either recruiting to come, as freshmen onto campus or transfers? What is that due diligence that they're required to do to make sure that they're not bringing people with a history of bad behavior on campus? Or if they are people with a history of bad behavior, what are some of the safety mechanisms that need to be in place?
Well, I mean, I heard one time somebody say some of the best hires were the ones I never made, in the employment sense. And I think you could say the same thing if you're a coach in terms of recruiting. Just because you have somebody who's a drop dead recruit in terms of their tools on the field doesn't mean they're going to be an asset to your program if they come in and they're a nightmare for you. And if they have a history of assaulting women and they're barely eligible and other things, and there are warning signs there, maybe it's best to not take that student on, because they may end up later subjecting that coach and that university to liability based on the behavior and the fact that they should have known better as they recruited that person on campus. And there have been cases where that has been alleged, where the school recruited this person and that was deliberate indifference to having actual knowledge of this person being a sexual predator based on their past record.
A very, very challenging situation for athletic directors who may not always even know what's going on with coaches. What are, in terms of, if we're trying to put a mental checklist together for athletic directors, what are some of the things you need to do proactively? And then, when the inevitable happens, that some of these things are going to arise under your umbrella, what are some of the reactive first steps that need to take place to really make sure?
I'm going to read from the materials that I just got this week that are very timely, if that's okay, from the Sports Lawyers Association, because I think they're important. The first thing is there has to be confidentiality. The victims have to be protected. That is paramount to the situation. If there isn't, the system's just not going to work. There's got to be timeliness to the procedure in place when something gets reported. You can't just sit and lag on something for months at a time. There's got to be multiple different ways to report something on campus. There can't just be you go to your coach and that's the only way for the person to tell you. There's got to be the opportunity to talk to the police, to talk to somebody confidentially within the maybe HR, a dean on campus, and also maybe a hotline if you want to set one up for a sexual assault hotline. That's a good way maybe that school might want to go. If there's some sort of an investigation, you've got to have no contact between the two people. I mean, you can't let them continue to be connecting to each other, and you've got to immediately bring in the police or somebody on campus to preserve anything that's involved in terms of the potential of evidence. You don't want anybody to say that the school botched the investigation after it ended. You want to make sure that every step of the way is done above board and properly, and that's where I think you need to call the police right away. There's got to be a process in place for a student hearing on campus for a conduct violation, parallel to the potential criminal issue or the Title IX issue. And there's got to be a real investigation into what happened and no retaliation. So I think those are important ways that a school can get out in front of it and have a good policy in place.
And you can imagine that some support is often really helpful in the situation where most athletic directors and administrators don't go into that profession thinking that this is where they're going to be spending the majority of their time. And it's obviously a fairly complex arena during very stressful moments if you're dealing with a crisis like that. What would
right?
be
You'd be amazed how many schools don't have a policy in place that seems as simple as that. They just don't have it in place, at least in a sufficient manner, to understand. Maybe it's on a piece of paper, but they don't have a game plan in place, or they don't practice what would happen if that occurred. They don't have a run through to actually, put that onto practice. And it's not so easy when you have that high stakes emotional situation to make sure that everything's done properly.
Do you have a sense of the prevalence of this? I think sometimes athletic directors just figure, well, I recognize that happens, but it won't happen under my watch, under my roof, right? And so do you have a sense of to give a scale of how often this is happening?
I think it's happening very often on college campuses throughout the country. We also shouldn't forget that it happens in high schools as well, but I know we're focusing primarily on collegiate institutions today, but it happens at all higher education, universities in one way or another. I mean, there's peer-to-peer violence, there's teachers on campus, and sometimes there's still this unbelievable attitude that they can get away with it, and that somehow their first semester English class is basically like a dating pool. I mean, that's the attitude of some of these professors still on campus.
That's crazy. Any final thoughts on this topic as we wrap up our conversation today?
Well, it's an very quickly, but ever growing area of the law where it's a very sensitive area where if a school doesn't handle it properly, they're going to regret it afterwards. So I would encourage all schools to hire someone to have a plan in place so that when this happens, they can call somebody to come in and handle the situation for them, or implement it for them, or help them implement it themselves. Because you only get one shot, and if you do it wrong, it's going to come back to bite you later.
Great advice, and certainly a number of athletic directors should be taking heed on this as well.
Maybe that's somebody calling you right now.
Look how quickly the message gets out there on live TV. This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And ways folks can follow you as they want to continue to hear your words of wisdom.
Well, yeah, I'm on Twitter at Greene, Greene Sports Law, and then my website we constantly update with blogs is globalsportsadvocates.com.
Great, Paul. Thank you as always for your expertise, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Josh. Take care.